There are structures that stand tall not just to refine oil, but to refine the will of an entire nation. There are flames that burn not only inside steel furnaces, but inside the hearts of hundreds of millions who were once told they were impossible. And in Lagos, Nigeria, amid forests of cranes and pipelines stretching endlessly like the veins of a giant waking from its sleep, there is such a flame. Dangote refinery. Every day, 650,000 barrels of crude oil are transformed into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, into power, into freedom, into a declaration that Nigeria is no longer the sleeping giant, and this is only the beginning. Aliko Dangote, the man once mocked for dreaming too big, is now preparing to double that dream. 1.4 million barrels a day, turning Nigeria into the nation with the largest oil refinery on earth. India has to look down. China has to recalculate. The United States has to stay alert. Because for the first time, an African nation is stepping into an arena where only superpowers once dared to play. But this is also when the cold winds begin to blow. When a nation stands tall, someone always feels threatened. On November 1st, 2025, a post appeared on Truth Social like an explosion in the dark. Nigeria is committing Christian genocide. We will cut aid. If we strike, it will be fast, deadly, sweet. Not the words of a diplomat. Not the words of someone who keeps peace. These were the words of a man describing war with pleasure. Why Nigeria? Why now? Why is it that when Nigeria was poor, chaotic, and dependent on imported fuel, no one spoke of genocide? Why is it only when Nigeria begins to rise, begins to stand on its own feet, that suddenly the world is worried about human rights? The answer is not in a church or a cathedral. It lies in those steel pipelines shining under the Lagos Sunday. It lies in the crude oil that flowed out of Nigeria for generations at dirt cheap prices. It lies in the fear of superpowers who are used to an Africa that exports raw materials and imports someone else's dreams. Because a Nigeria that can refine its own oil is a Nigeria that can refine its own destiny. A Nigeria that is energy independent will no longer tremble at threatening letters, IMF conditions, or diplomatic trips with smiling faces and hands gripping invisible chains. And when Nigeria rises, Africa shakes. That is what truly worries the West. But if it were only worry, they would stay silent. When they threaten openly, it means the Dangote flame has grown too bright, bright enough to illuminate the shadows they want to hide. Because history has written the same lesson again and again. Whenever a third world nation gets close to economic independence, the darkness of intervention breakaway states descends. Of Burkina Faso and Libya paid the price. Iraq paid the price. Syria paid the price. And now the words fast, deadly, sweet appear like a warning that Nigeria stands exactly where history has placed those nations before. The most dangerous position of all, the position of someone about to be free. But this time, something is different. Nigeria is not alone. And Africa is no longer a continent of political innocence. A new generation has risen. And somewhere else, near the border of Burkina Faso, a young man stands in the Sahel dust and speaks 8 words that awaken an entire continent. We do not ask for permission to be free. His name is Ibrahim Traoré, and his story, along with Nigeria's confrontation with the invisible hands of power, has only just begun. Nigeria is not an ordinary nation. It is the giant of Africa, a giant forced to sleep for decades by chains of economic manipulation, so subtle that even its own people sometimes forgot their true strength. 200 million people, 3 major religions, hundreds of ethnic groups, massive oil reserves, and the most strategic geopolitical position in West Africa, Nigeria, was born to be a center of power. But instead of rising, the nation was strangled by a bitter paradox. Oil beneath its feet, yet gasoline had to be begged for. For years, Nigeria exported crude oil at dirt cheap prices, then imported refined fuel at costs many times higher. Its economy was turned into a closed circle, enriching others while impoverishing itself. Every energy crisis, every spike in fuel prices, every hour people stood in long lines at gas stations, none of it was fate. It was the consequence of long-term dependence. Then the Dangote refinery arrived like a fist, shattering those chains. Not just a refinery, not just steel and fire. It was the declaration of a nation waking up. For the first time, Nigeria wasn't sending crude away. It was turning its own future into liquid, gas, heat into pipelines, into steel arteries, into sparks lighting up the Lagos night like a blazing message. We are no longer selling our dreams. This awakening did not happen quietly, because every time an African nation touches the threshold of independence, the world begins to pay attention not with respect, but with fear. They know a truth Nigerians sometimes forget. When Nigeria grows strong, the entire continent changes with it, because Nigeria is not just Nigeria. It is the cultural, economic, and political center of West Africa. It is a nation with a voice loud enough to shake the global balance of power. If Nigeria refines its own oil, Ghana, Benin, Togo, Cameroon, Niger all benefit. If Nigeria stops importing fuel, Western corporations lose tens of billions of dollars a year. If Nigeria begins exporting refined products, the energy order of the whole region must be rewritten. Do you think it's a coincidence that threats from Washington appeared now? Not because of religious conflict, not because of concern for human rights, but because of an ancient fear embedded in imperialism, the fear of watching someone they once belittled begin to stand tall. But Nigeria's awakening does not come only from steel, it comes from its people. A young generation raised with the internet, TikTok, YouTube, a generation that clearly sees the exploitation model their parents were blinded to. They know that every barrel refined at home is a blow against the system that kept Africa poor for centuries. They share Dangote videos like symbols of victory. They repost Traoré's speeches like scriptures of freedom. They call Nigeria the sleeping giant, and Dangote is the slap that wakes the giant. But the moment that giant stirs, the darkness begins to move. Western headlines suddenly surge. Human rights crisis. Religious war. Genocide threat. Intervention needed to prevent massacre. All familiar. It is the old playbook of foreign intervention. Turn an economic story into a moral one. Turn a rising nation into a dangerous nation. Turn its people into victims to justify interference. But this time, Nigeria is different, because the giant is opening its eyes. And when a giant opens its eyes, it sees every hand trying to hold it down. This is no longer the story of Nigeria needs peace. This is the story of Nigeria needs freedom. And freedom always has a price. That price is beginning to appear in threats, in gunpowder-scented tweets, in news headlines deliberately inflaming religious divides. But Nigeria understands what's happening. Africa understands what's happening. And history knows this chapter all too well. Because one truth is becoming clear. No one threatens a weak nation. They only threaten nations that are growing strong. And Nigeria, for the first time in decades, is rising in a way that makes the entire world uneasy. No nation on earth is perfect, and neither is Nigeria. Violence has existed here for years, from Boko Haram to extremist groups in the Middle Belt, from land disputes to long-standing community tensions. But what is happening is not a war of religion or faith. It is a war of poverty, of land, of power, of unemployment, of regions abandoned for decades. Yet in a single night, that complex reality was compressed into one simple slogan: Christian genocide in Nigeria. That phrase spread like fire in the dark, not because it was true, but because it was useful. Useful for whom? Not for Nigerians. Not for the people suffering, but useful for those who needed an excuse to interfere in the internal affairs of a nation growing too strong. To understand the distortion, all you need to do is look at the numbers Western media never mention. Boko Haram attacked Kahedeksankumendakolme churches, but also attacked 72 mosques. They killed more than 2,000 Muslims and around 1,500 Christians. In many regions, Christian and Muslim communities were attacked together, buried their dead together, and fled their villages together. If this is a religious genocide, then why are both religions victims? No one answers that question. No one wants to answer it. Because Christian genocide is only the outer shell, a sugar-coated moral story hiding a much deeper goal: control of oil, control of markets, control of the economic future of West Africa. From Washington to Brussels, from closed-door rooms to major media outlets, a parallel reality has been constructed. Nigeria is no longer a nation building the largest refinery on earth. Nigeria becomes a chaotic state in need of intervention. And so, Dangote refinery disappears from the headlines. Only blood, fear, and sensationalism remain. This is the art of shaping public opinion, a technique as old as history itself. Create a crisis, then present yourself as the solution. Libya was painted as a threat to the world. Iraq as a nation holding weapons of mass destruction. Syria as the greatest humanitarian disaster of our time. Idearies, each story began with an emotional headline and ended with bombs, bullets, and a country turned to ashes. Now, Nigeria stands on that list. But the most alarming thing is when they chose their moment. Not when Nigeria was most chaotic. Not when Boko Haram was strongest. Not when religious tensions were highest. But right when Nigeria was closest to independence. Why? Because Nigeria's self-sufficiency is a far greater threat than any terrorist group. A poor Nigeria is easy to control. A dependent Nigeria is easy to manipulate. A divided Nigeria is easy to dominate. But an energy-independent Nigeria on the verge of becoming the refinery hub of a continent is no longer a piece on their chessboard. And so, the story was rewritten. Religion is the root of all conflict, though the truth says otherwise. Nigerians are slaughtering each other, though communities have lived together for centuries. A massacre is unfolding, no verification, no evidence. The world must act immediately. Act how? Act who? And for what purpose? The answer is not in the tear-soaked headlines. It lies in the oil contracts beginning to shake. It lies in European refineries trembling at the thought of losing their market. It lies in the fear of investors who benefited for too long from Africa's weakness. But what the architects of this manufactured crisis did not expect was the shift in African consciousness. A new generation no longer swallows stories crafted thousands of miles away. They question, they investigate, they tear off the mask. And that is why the Christian genocide narrative did not succeed as planned. Not because it lacked drama, but because Nigerians and Africans are beginning to understand something important. When your freedom is getting close, someone will create a nightmare to keep you from waking up. And Nigeria is waking up fast, fierce, but they are not the only nation seeing through the illusion. Somewhere else in the Sahel desert, a young leader recognized this manufactured crisis long ago and chose to break it with his own hands. If you spread out a world map on a table and mark every nation that once dared take a single step outside Western control, you will see something terrifying, a web of wounds connected like veins of blood. Those wounds are not accidents. They are the marks of an intervention cycle written decades ago, a cycle that repeats with chilling precision. And once you understand that cycle, you understand why Nigeria is being targeted. Every tragedy begins with a noble act. Libya sought to create a unified African currency backed by gold. Iraq wanted to sell oil in euros instead of dollars. Iran wanted to control its own energy sector without Washington. Syria sought to build its own gas pipeline, competing with Europe. Afghanistan tried to break free from strategic dependence. Each of these nations shared one dream: to manage their own resources. Not greed, not ambition, just the desire to keep what belonged to them. But to superpowers, that is the greatest crime. Manufacture a crisis, the people are in danger. When a nation is weak, it is ignored. But when a nation grows stronger, the narrative changes. Suddenly the world cares about human rights, democracy, religious freedom, regional security. These ideas sound noble, but they are simply cloth covering the barrel of a gun. Libya was accused of massacring civilians. Iraq was accused of having weapons of mass destruction. Syria was accused of crushing democratic movements. Afghanistan became the global hub of terrorism. No claim was fully verified. No story was told honestly, but Western media repeated it until the world believed it was truth. And now, Nigeria carries its own label, Christian genocide, an emotional, viral phrase, yet anti-science, anti-data, anti-reality. Why? Because the goal was never the truth. The goal was the excuse. Intervention. When aid arrives with bombs, Once the excuse is strong enough, the rest unfolds quickly. Sanctions, diplomatic isolation, no-fly zones. Troops sent to protect civilians, governments overthrown, Western-friendly regimes installed. Libya fell into chaos. Iraq became a battlefield. Syria was torn into fragments. Afghanistan was occupied for 20 years. All these nations were saved, and after being saved, they lost resources, sovereignty, stability, their future. That is the price of Western freedom, freedom sold with ammunition. Reconstruction. When resources return to foreign hands, once a nation is shattered, the rebuilding begins. Billion-dollar contracts are signed. American, British, and French companies enter. Energy and mineral resources accidentally fall into foreign hands. Libya lost control of its oil. Iraq had to redistribute its energy market. Syria became a geopolitical chessboard. Afghanistan lost its minerals to foreign corporations, and the cycle closes ready to reactivate whenever another nation rises. Why is Nigeria now in stage 2 of the cycle? Because Nigeria just did something no African nation has ever done at scale. It built an entire oil and gas value chain without Western permission. Nigeria did not ask the IMF, did not ask USAID, did not ask the EU, did not take conditional loans from the World Bank. Nigeria bypassed the global financial system, the biggest leash Western powers have. Nigeria broke the script. Nigeria did what they fear most: self-reliance. And according to the logic of the intervention cycle, the next step must be create a crisis. Turn the nation into a threat. Prepare global opinion for forceful action. Trump's fast, deadly, sweet tweet was not a joke. It was the opening gunshot. But this time, there is something the cycle did not predict. Africa is not what it used to be. Its young generation is not what it used to be. And Nigeria is not standing alone. Because somewhere else, in the heart of the Sahel, a young leader has done what Libya, Iraq, and Syria never managed. He said no directly, fearlessly, and survived. His name is Ibrahim Traoré, and his presence is the variable the intervention cycle never saw coming. The world once believed that the cycle of interventions in Africa was eternal, that every time a nation rose, it would be crushed, that Africa would forever turn in the same loop: rise, be attacked, collapse, rise again with someone else's help. But history sometimes changes, not because of an army, not because of an alliance, but because of one young man daring to say what the world never had the courage to say. That man appeared in the Sahel, a land the world treated as wasteland, a land plundered, bombed, labeled terror zone, and used as justification to maintain foreign military bases. Yet there, in the red dust and burning wind, a 3-4-year-old stood up and declared, "We do not ask for permission to be free." Those words did not echo only in Burkina Faso. They traveled through Mali, Niger, Ghana, Chad, Nigeria, and reached the crowded streets of Lagos, where millions of young Nigerians began to understand that freedom is not granted. It must be taken. When Ibrahim Traoré emerged, the West saw him as a temporary spark, a rebel symbol who would fade like so many others in Africa's political history. They were catastrophically wrong, because they failed to understand that Traoré is not just an individual. He is the crystallization of 60 years of frustration under fake independence, the voice of an African youth exhausted by foreign control, the symbol of a continent determined to break invisible chains. The West is accustomed to dealing with older leaders, dependent, compromising, predictable. But this time they face a man with the eyes of a soldier, the heart of the youth, and the clarity of a politician who refuses to bow. While other nations collapsed under isolation, Traoré did the opposite. He united an entire region. He expelled French troops, yet did not close the country. He rejected the IMF, yet opened the door to investments with clear conditions. He never begged for weapons, yet built a wide, self-reliant Sahel Defense Alliance. To the West, this is the ultimate sin. He broke the dependency model. To Africans, it is a miracle. He proved that even a small nation can survive after saying no to empire, because they see themselves in him. He is not afraid. He does not bow. He refuses to treat Western power as destiny. He does what older leaders always avoided. Traoré became a mirror, something Nigeria had not seen in a long time, a living proof that Africa does not need permission to be sovereign. Videos of him spread across Nigerian TikTok, across universities in Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt. Young people watch him as proof that their generation can break the old order. And because of that, Trump's fast, deadly, sweet tweet no longer scares Nigerians. It only makes them sharper, more aware, more determined. For decades, Africa was portrayed as a continent waiting to be saved. But Traoré appeared and did one thing powerful enough to flip a century of propaganda. He made Africa believe it can save itself. This is more dangerous than any bomb, missile, or coup, because it destroys the most powerful weapon of imperialism, inferiority. Once young people believe they can stand on their own, everything changes. They stop fearing the West, they stop trusting foreign media, they stop seeing themselves as victims of history. They begin seeing Nigeria, Burkina, Faso, Mali, Niger as pieces of a future they can rebuild, a future where Africa is the owner, not the subject. Nigeria sees a version of itself in political adolescence, a figure bold enough to confront superpowers directly, a path different from dependency, a reminder that every nation can choose to say no. But Nigeria is not Burkina Faso. Nigeria is a giant. And when a giant awakens, it reshapes the global balance of power. Which is why this story is no longer about Traoré or Nigeria alone. It is becoming the spread of an idea. The idea that Africa does not need permission because freedom is not a gift, but a conquest. There is a truth many Western observers do not see or choose not to see. The changes happening in Africa today did not begin in high-level summits, nor in official declarations, nor in closed-door meetings between presidents. They began in a place no one expected, the phones of young people. Somehow, the awakening of an entire continent did not erupt in parliament halls, but on TikTok, YouTube, Telegram, Twitter. Every short video, every quote from Traoré, every image of the Dangote refinery blazing in the Lagos night. All of it became tiny sparks, and then those sparks met each other, merging into a wildfire, burning down a mindset of dependency that lasted for centuries. Africa's young generation sees the world in a completely different way from their parents. Their parents grew up in the post-colonial era when Western presence was considered essential. They were taught that without aid, Africa would collapse. Without the IMF, the economy would suffocate. Without foreign troops, their countries would fall into chaos. But today's generation did not grow up with those lessons. They grew up with truth exposed on the internet. They saw Libya before and after 2011. They saw Iraq before and after the invasion. They saw Afghanistan before and after 20 years of occupation. They saw foreign military bases spread across African soil like fungus, yet security did not improve and economies did not advance. They saw the truth. Every place the West intervened to help, that place ended up worse. And they asked a question. If this model always fails, why are we still following it? Once that question is asked, it cannot be silenced. The question spread. It reached students in Mali, workers in Niger, taxi drivers in Ghana, engineers in Kenya, artists in Namibia. And suddenly, everyone realized they were not alone. The awakening did not arrive as one nation rising, but as an entire generation rising at the same time. When they saw Traoré in Burkina Faso expel French forces and the country did not collapse, they understood their fear had been nothing more than political intimidation. When they saw Nigeria build the Dangote refinery with its own resources, they realized progress does not require kneeling. When they saw Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso form the Sahel alliance, they realized regional unity is not a fantasy. And something strange but completely logical began to happen. Traoré's videos spread not most strongly in Burkina Faso, but in Nigeria. Because Nigerian youth living fast, urban, inside West Africa's most dynamic economy felt Traoré's words deeply. His words voiced what they already knew, but no one dared to say. Africa is not weak, it is divided. Africa is not poor, it is legally plundered. Africa does not need permission, it only needs belief. Once the young generation understood this, everything flipped. They no longer trust Western government statements. They no longer trust distorted headlines. They no longer believe religious conflict in Nigeria is a reason for intervention. They see through the fog. They see that behind the Christian genocide narrative lies the truth. A nation that just built the largest refinery in the world is being smeared at the exact moment it enters an age of self-reliance. This is no longer just Nigeria's story. It is the lesson the entire African youth has drawn. If one nation breaks its chains, others will follow. If one nation rises, it pulls the rest upward. And that is what the West fears most. This awakening has no official leader, no party, no registered movement, no headquarters, no funding, no structure. It has only one thing: the belief that Africa's voice is no longer small. No army can extinguish that. No sanction can crush it. No threatening tweet can shake it. Because once a generation wakes up, it cannot go back to sleep. And this new psychological foundation places Nigeria in a different position. It is no longer a lonely target of a media attack, but the center of a continental consciousness, a movement Traoré became the accidental symbol of. The battle Nigeria faces is not only its own. It is the next chapter in the journey of an entire continent reclaiming the dignity stolen over generations. If you lay out a map of Africa's resources and place on top of it a map of wars, crises, and foreign military interventions, you will see something chilling. The two maps overlap almost perfectly, not by accident, not by geographic coincidence, but by rule. A rule that has never changed for centuries. Where there is wealth, there is blood. People often say Africa is a poor continent, but the truth is the opposite. Africa is not poor. It is so rich that it is dangerous. So rich that the powerful cannot leave it alone. So rich that its resources become the core of every struggle, every scheme of exploitation, every cycle of modern imperialism. Many Nigerians have asked, why are we rich but living poor? The answer lies in the very structure of the global economy. Africa exports what is cheapest and rawest, and imports what is most refined and most expensive. It sells gold to buy jewelry, sells cocoa to buy chocolate, sells oil to buy gasoline, sells diamonds to buy cut diamonds. That is not exchange. That is colonization dressed as economic. The moment Nigeria decided to break this cycle with the Dangote refinery, the balance shifted instantly, because that refinery does not just produce fuel. It produces the one thing the world does not want Nigeria or any African nation to possess: value-added power. In the global economy, power does not belong to those who have resources, but to those who control the refinement and distribution of those resources. Libya had oil, but not the refining. Congo has cobalt, but not the processing technology. Nigeria has crude oil, but for decades did not control the output. That is why, despite massive resources, power stayed in the hands of the countries buying them, not the countries owning them. The Dangote refinery changes the entire game, because when a nation produces what it once had to import, it not only reduces dependency, it reverses the entire flow of money. Instead of money flowing out, money flows in. Instead of jobs leaving, jobs return. Instead of revenue falling into the pockets of foreign oil companies, it returns to Nigerians. This is a nightmare for those who want Africa to stay at the bottom. This is why a refinery is suddenly labeled a geopolitical threat. Nigerians understand this. Africans understand this because they have seen it too many times. Gaddafi was overthrown right after talking about a gold-backed African currency. Saddam Hussein was taken down after announcing he would sell oil in euros. Iran is isolated because it insists on energy independence. Venezuela is sanctioned because it holds the world's largest oil reserves but refuses Washington's rules. It is no coincidence that every nation trying to escape the petrodollar system is framed as dangerous. And now Nigeria, the most populous, the strongest, the most oil-rich nation in Africa, is stepping onto that same path. Energy independence, industrial independence, financial independence. To the Nigerian people, this is pride. To the West, this is a threat. To foreign oil companies, this is a direct strike at tens of billions of dollars in profit. But to Africa, this is the greatest breakthrough in a generation. Because a self-reliant Nigeria means a self-reliant West Africa. And a self-reliant West Africa means Africa, for the first time this century, has a chance to redefine its place in the world. Many in the West ask, why has Nigeria suddenly become the center of attention? Africans don't ask that. They ask, why is the world only afraid of Nigeria now? Because the moment resources are refined domestically, the moment value stops leaking outward, the moment power stays in the hands of the local people, everything changes. That is when a poor nation becomes a threat, not because it is aggressive, but because it finally understands its real power. And once that power is found, no one can take it away. There are moments in history when a nation is placed at a crossroads not because of itself, but because the rest of the world trembles at the future it might create. And Nigeria right now stands at such a crossroads. It is no coincidence that threats, accusations, and media campaigns are suddenly aimed at Nigeria. It is no coincidence that the West has become deeply concerned about religious tensions, human rights, and security in this very country. The only true coincidence is timing, right when Nigeria begins to break the centuries-old economic model of dependence. Nigeria is not just a nation. It is Africa's lever. A strong Nigeria lifts all the nations around it. An energy-independent Nigeria opens the door for Ghana, Benin, Togo, Cameroon, Niger to become industrial economies instead of resource economies. A Nigeria that refuses to bow to Western pressure sends a powerful signal to the entire continent. Freedom is possible. That is the future the old powers fear most. Because if Nigeria succeeds, the entire system of exploiting Africa collapses. No more easy-to-control nations. No more cheap resource exporters. No more trillion-dollar markets purchasing refined products from Europe and the United States. An independent Nigeria is a threat to the system, not Africa's system, but the system that has enriched foreign nations with African resources for centuries. For years, the story told to Africa has always been the same. You need us. You cannot stand on your own. You must follow loan conditions. You must tighten your belts. You must open your markets under our guidelines. You must accept military presence for peacekeeping. And you must call this cooperation. But Nigeria today no longer listens. The Dangote refinery has shown them the truth. They do not need anyone to rise. They only need themselves. And that is exactly why the world is afraid. If Nigeria remains firm, the exploitation model breaks. If Nigeria keeps refining oil, Africa's oil economy will change forever. If Nigeria refuses to submit, Africa's youth will fully awaken. One nation of 200 million saying no is one thing, but a continent of 1.4 billion saying no is something entirely different. But Nigeria's importance is not just population. It is position, it is leadership, it is its ability to create a domino effect. If Nigeria collapses under pressure, the message to the rest of Africa is crystal clear. Don't dream of independence. If Nigeria, the strongest, cannot stand, then what hope is there for Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Ghana, Zambia, or Congo? But if Nigeria stands upright, the message becomes even stronger. Self-reliance is not a fantasy. It is a real path. Burkina Faso proved it in poverty, isolation, and sanctions. So what happens if the strongest nation on the continent does the same? The world will be forced to treat Africa with respect, not directives. Resources will no longer be taken at bargain prices. Unfair contracts will be torn apart. Foreign military bases will lose their justification. And the nations that lived comfortably off African dependence will face the greatest reckoning in generations. Nigeria stands between two roads. One leads back to the past dependence, intervention, engineered crises. The other leads to the future where Nigeria does not just change itself, but changes Africa. But the road to self-reliance is always dangerous. It requires courage. It requires wisdom. It requires national unity. It requires a country to understand that its greatest strength is not oil, not gas, not its economy, but its refusal to bow. And at the moment Nigeria faces this crossroads, one face rises in the minds of millions across Africa: Ibrahim Traoré. Not because he is perfect, not because he is the strongest, but because he proved that even the smallest, poorest, most threatened nation can stand tall and survive. If Burkina Faso can do it, there is no reason Nigeria cannot. If a tiny nation can break the intervention cycle, a giant can break the global power structure. And that is the greatest fear of those watching Nigeria right now. There are moments in history that are not marked by fireworks, not recorded in treaties, not preserved in museums. They are simply the moments when a people recognize their true strength, strength that lies in their voice, their will, their awakening. Nigeria is entering such a moment, not through promises, not through begging, but through reality. A colossal refinery standing proudly in Lagos, shining like the lighthouse of an entire continent. From above, the Dangote refinery is not just steel, machinery, and massive pipelines. It is the image of Africa choosing to take the wheel of its own destiny. It is proof that centuries of exploitation can be reversed by a single right decision, by a generation daring to think differently. But the path Nigeria is choosing is not theirs alone. It is the test of all Africa. Because if Nigeria withstands the pressure, if Nigeria keeps refining oil, keeps processing its resources, keeps rejecting the so-called help wrapped in coercion, if the most populous nation on the continent proves that self-reliance does not destroy a people but liberates them, then Africa's story will enter a new chapter. For the first time in generations, Africa is seeing a different image of itself. No longer a land of war and hunger. No longer merely a consumer market. No longer the continent sitting at the bottom of wealth rankings. This continent is beginning to see what the world has tried to hide, its true strength. But, like every truth in this era, that strength survives only if someone stands up to protect it. Nigeria may build the largest refinery in the world. Burkina Faso may withstand sanctions. Mali and Niger may break old chains of control. But if the youth do not continue to speak, do not continue to defend the truth, do not continue to challenge fabricated narratives, everything gained can be crushed in an instant. Because the force confronting Nigeria is not just a government, it is an international system of interest that has existed for over a century. They do not want to lose control. They do not want Africa to stand. They do not want value to remain on the continent. And they will do everything, spread disinformation, create crises, inflame conflicts, anything to keep the extraction machine spinning in their favor. But there is one thing they cannot control, the will of the young. That will is rising everywhere. In Lagos universities, where students debate whether Nigeria should accept threats from abroad. In cafes across Accra, where young Ghanaians say that if Nigeria succeeds, West Africa will change forever. In forums in Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, where people see Traoré as proof that dignity can defeat an entire system, the new generation no longer waits for leaders to speak for them. They speak for themselves. They share for themselves. They connect on their own. That is the one power no empire in history has ever overcome. The power of a people who have awakened. And if Nigeria does not back down, Africa will never return to the era of asking permission just to exist. If Nigeria keeps standing tall, Africa will learn to stand tall. If Nigeria completes its dream of self-reliance, this century could be the first in which Africa is not written about by others, but writes its own story. You are living in that moment. A moment not only for Nigerians, Burkinabe, Malians, but for anyone who believes freedom is a right, not a gift. If you want to hear more stories like this told clearly, analyzed deeply, spread powerfully, let your voice join this awakening. Share your thoughts below. Tell me what you feel. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any part of Africa's journey to sovereignty. Because this story is not told only through my voice. It will continue to be written through yours.